My name is Bob Grant, and I'm an early KYer. I started out doing character parts on the Gizmo Goodkin radio show on Saturday mornings on WKY radio. I got that job through Hoyt Andres, who was the assistant manager for radio. As a matter of fact, at that time in the late 40s, his secretary was Thelma, who ended up being Thelma Gaylord. But I got a job as a page at the radio station because of that connection. And as it turned out, I worked a half a day as a page at the radio station and a half a day on the stage crew in the little theater with the day that television went on the air in 1949. So I guess I'm as old a pioneer as most anybody. But I loved doing that. It was a lot of fun. And that fall, I was a senior in high school, and I worked the football games at Taft Stadium, which Channel 4 televised on Thursday and Friday nights. And then I worked full-time on the stage crew in 1950. And the irony about that was the radio and television department at OU brought their kids down to use our equipment because they didn't have any. And I odd man and won and got to go drink coffee. So I really didn't think much of the OU radio and television production department. Went down to OU that fall, worked the home games, and I really wasn't going to major in radio and television production because of what they thought about the head of the department. And after a couple of years, I thought, well, it'd be easier since I've got some experience. And so I jumped right in the middle of a 4.5-year planned program. And unfortunately, my college career was a disaster because I spent most of my time partying. But I finally left, went in the service, wanted to get into Army television. The only requirement for Army television at that point in time was the motion picture school at Fort Monmouth, New Jersey. I managed to get myself in that program. And in the Army's great wisdom, since they desperately needed people with commercial experience at the Pictorial Center in New York, sent me to Japan to be a motion picture photographer. And so I did. I had a great time. But of course the medium then was 16mm black and white movie film. I wrote back to Hoyt Andres about 6 months before I was to get out of the service and told him I'd really like to have a job because in the meantime I had gotten married, had a year-old kid that I hadn't seen when I got out of the service. And Hoyt wrote me back and said, well, I'm down at Montgomery, Alabama now, and I get the impression that you probably would like to stay in Oklahoma City. So why don't you go talk to the people at Channel 4 when you get there? And so I got back and bought a cheap car, drove down here, walked in the WKY and talked to, I can't remember who I talked to then, but what I was told was, don't call us, we'll call you. And it just so happened that the switchboard operator was a girl I'd gone to high school with. And when I walked in the newsroom, in the lobby, the newsroom was there on the left at the time, and Hoyt Andres was back. Had been back about 2 weeks. So I went to Louise Suggs, who was Louise Beals, who was the switchboard operator, and said, could you call Hoyt and see if I could talk to him? And so she got on the phone and told me how to get up to his office. And I went upstairs and went down the hall to his office, and we chatted for 10 or 15 minutes about my history and what I'd done in school and what I'd done in the Army as a motion picture photographer. And he said, well, let's see this. Why don't you go get your family, get back down here and get settled, and come on in, because if we don't have a job, I'm going to make one. And I appreciated that. Well, so I got out of the service in late February of 1957 and moved my family down, found a place to live, and came to work. And one of the first things that happened was that they had a big snowstorm, and I flew in a C-47 up to the Panhandle and was leaning out the bay as they knocked bales of hay out for the cattle. And I got back, and in those days, you dressed for the best thing you were going to, which was a banquet. So everybody wore a suit all the time. And I got back, and technology was not quite as good as it is now, and they were going to do a little insert kind of a deal and have me drive up the circle driveway and get out and hand the film to somebody who'd get it processed, and then they'd interview me. And they ran a live camera out the door, and I'm wearing this suit. And they say, well, we can't have you wearing a suit. And I said, well, that's what I wore when I went. And they said, well, somebody loaned me a leather jacket so I'd look more rugged. So I came peeling up with this staged interview and handed somebody the film, and then they did an interview with me. Another thing that I remember about that first year was that we had the first big multi-agency drug raid all over town. There was the Highway Patrol, and there was the FBI, and there was the Secret Service, and there was the Oklahoma City Police Department and the Sheriff's Department. And of course, I had a camera with a light on the end stuck on it, and I was always the second guy in the door because there was more light there. And the thing I really remember about that was that I worked all night and put in about 12 hours overtime, and they said, gee, Bob, you can't put in that much overtime. Why don't you take some comp time and we'll pay you a part of the overtime? So for 12 hours, I took 8 hours overtime and 8 hours comp time, which I thought was fair. Since they had used the film for about 5 newscasts and a network feed, I'd loved working at Channel 4. As a matter of fact, in the 7 years I was there, I think I met 7 presidents. Probably the smartest guy I ever met and had a chance to sit down and interview for an hour was John Tower, who was then a senator from Texas. He was a keynote speaker at the Republican State Convention, and you could have held that convention in a phone booth, I think, because there weren't that many Republicans around in those days. But a brilliant guy and an interesting guy to talk to. One of the highlights, I think, of my career was that I covered the boycott that happened when the young black kids showed up at Katz Drug Store at Main and Robinson. I was there with a camera, and I covered that whole saga over whatever period of time that was. And the interesting thing to me was there was never a hand raised in anger. They had sit-ins, and they took people off to jail who were blocking the way at Bishop's and Anamont Cafeteria, but there was never any anger over the deal. And I appreciated that in light of the fact that back in the 20s, as most people know who've studied Oklahoma, there were race riots in Tulsa, and 100 people got killed, and they destroyed the near north side black community. But it was interesting for me to do that. I remember also that Ernie Schultz and I went in 1960 to cover the Democratic Convention in Los Angeles. And I did a 3-minute film of a parade for Lyndon Johnson, who was running for president at the time. He didn't make it, but the one thing that made me feel good was they never put a clip, never made a splice in that roll of film, and they ran it. There was also a deal earlier before that in the late 50s of a guy who invented a flying saucer, and his logic sounded good, but it just wasn't realistic. That flying saucer ended up as a ride at Frontier City, and he finally got put in jail for fraud. And I even interviewed him up in the courthouse. And in 1960, he had already gotten out of jail and moved away and was outside of Los Angeles, California. And Ernie and I went out and did an interview with him. And he still proclaimed that deal would work fine. I found out later that a whole bunch of civic leaders had just in case, had invested some money in his, quote, flying saucer, including Mr. Gaylord. Interestingly enough, the guy who got me my first job was Hoyt Andres, and he was the assistant manager for radio. And P.A. Sugg, who was also an executive with Mr. Gaylord, was the station manager for the radio station. And I found out later, Mr. Gaylord loved ex-FBI agents, and both these guys were ex-FBI agents. And of course, Hoyt Andres ended up becoming station manager and moved to Montgomery, Alabama. In fact, when I wrote him asking for a job when I was in the service, he was the station manager in the station that the Gaylords owned in Montgomery, Alabama, and it was his impetus that covered the bus boycotts for the lady who wouldn't sit in the back of the bus, because at that point in time, nobody in Alabama would cover a race story. They didn't exist in their mind, which was interesting. But he did, and he sold stories to every network, and two of his people end up getting hired by the network. Luckily he had come back when I showed up to try to get a job. But in addition, the first two directors were also ex-FBI agents, Jack Hauser and Bob Swissgood. I don't know whatever happened to them, but they looked like linebackers, I think. But they were big ex-FBI agents, and Mr. Gaylord thought an ex-FBI agent could do anything. So he had a propensity to hire ex-FBI agents to be executives and do things in his company. And I thought that was very interesting. One of the people that I remember was a guy named Russell Pearson. And Russell was the farm manager, farm director for Channel 4 for decades and decades. And my wife just recently got out of inpatient rehab at Epworth facility here in Oklahoma City, and I find out that Russell Pearson is across the hall. 101-year-old Russell Pearson was there, and I went in to see him every day, and I'm still going back to see him once a week now. His mind's still strong, but his body's not doing too well at 101 years old. But it was fascinating to me to learn that he was still around, still alive, and was a really good farm director for that station. When I think about presidents, I think about John Kennedy, and he'd made a speech at Big Cedar, and I don't know if any Oklahomans remember or know anything about Big Cedar, but it's down in the Comanche Mountains in southeastern Oklahoma, and the population's 3. The day we were there, the population was about 500, mostly news people, and it was interesting to go down there and cover him making that speech. To who, I don't know, I guess to the press. But another little Dixie story that I remember was there was a killing in Dogpatch. There really is a Dogpatch, Oklahoma. And that was rough, tough country. And I got sent down to cover the preliminary hearing of this guy. And if I'm going to cover this with just a little silent film, I've got to go in and get some pictures of that place. And so I'm driving through the mountains, and the roads are about 20 feet wide or 18 feet wide, and they wind through these mountains. And just before I get to Dogpatch, I see a burned out church. And I get to Dogpatch, and Dogpatch is this little bitty store in the woods that's a combination grocery store, I assume bar, and service station. No inhabitants. I see no one except a dog. So I take my film and take pictures of the dog walking around. But I promise you that I was watched every minute I was there. And when I came back, I started back, I called them on the two-way radio, and they wanted to get it on the air, and I drove 100 miles an hour trying to get back to Channel 4 to put that film on the air and write a script. And the irony was I wrote a 4-minute script, put it on the air, and they ran it 3 other times and never changed the script or didn't change the edit. The first summer after I went to work for Channel 4 in 1957, I got asked to fly over to Camp Chaffee right outside of Arkansas to do some film features. And so they picked me up in a little L-19, and I flew over and did a bunch of features and flew back. And then they started trying to recruit me to join the 95th Division, Army Training Division, because of my connection with Channel 4. And I finally did that because I never did want to be at PFC again. And I spent about 13 years in the Army Reserve, and ironically, I ended up getting a direct commission as a first lieutenant and retired from the Army Reserve as a captain because of my connection with Channel 4. And we'd go to either Chaffee, and then we finally went to Fort Polk, Louisiana, and would provide cover stories or feature stories for not only Channel 4, but stations in 3 states during that period of time. The one thing I always tried to do was I never featured an officer. I always featured the enlisted man, because the enlisted men I thought were the backbone of the station. Of course, if you want to look at it that way, the enlisted men in the news department were the backbone of the news department too. You know, there was Bob Chaddick, and there was Bob Gamble, and there was Dick John, and Houston Hall came. Houston was a good photographer. He was very lucky. We have so much storm coverage today that it's phenomenal. But in those days, we tried to chase storms, and we didn't find very many. Houston Hall was one of those lucky people who he turned his camera on to shoot something going down a highway, and a wreck happened in front of him. And he did get some film of a live tornado. I chased tornadoes for 7 years and never saw one. I saw the aftermath of some. In fact, in '64, I was doing a 5-minute newscast at the end of match game at 3:25 in the afternoon, and they stuck a note under my nose in the middle of the broadcast, and there was a tornado on the ground in Wichita Falls, Texas. And ironically, we broke that story. We had it even before the wire service did, because our assignment editor picked up the phone, or the acting assignment editor picked up the phone to call the station down there to see if they had some kind of feature that we could use that would be applicable to both states. And he said, I can't talk to you now. We got a tornado on the ground. It's been on the ground for 30 minutes, and everybody in this building is out covering it. And our guy said, put your phone by the speaker system for your intercom. And so he wrote it up, and we put it on the air. I got off the air at 3:25, and at 3:45, Virgil Dominic and I were in the news truck on our way to Wichita Falls. We stayed there and covered that all night. Same kind of thing that we have happen here, except there were more houses that were not slab houses, but that were built on foundations. I remember seeing a straw all the way through a piece of angle iron. I also covered a story of a family who gathered underneath the dining room table on the dining room rug, and when the tornado went through, there was nothing left but them and the table. The rug was gone and the house was gone, and they were still there. Another family jumped in the coat closet. The whole house disappeared except for the coat closet. Those are the kinds of things that happened then and happen now. After I had worked at Channel 4 the summers of '49 and '50 and the falls of '49 and '50, my parents had moved to Tulsa when I went to school at OU. And the summer of '51, I walked into KOTV in Tulsa and told them of what my background was and told them I wanted a summer job. And this guy looked at me like, "You lying punk, I'm going to call your bluff." He said, "Well, you know we have a director here named Roy Rector who used to work at Channel 4. And I said, "You mean old silver-haired Roy? I know him. Go ask him. I can live with whatever he tells you about me." And the guy left and came back in about 10 minutes and said, "Can you start now?" Which I thought was kind of funny. At that time, the weatherman at Channel 6 in Tulsa was Harry Volkmann. Harry Volkmann was ended up being a nationally renowned weatherman, but he was a self-taught weatherman. My personal observation was he was a nice guy, but he could not carry on a conversation unless you were talking about the weather. He had all his own little equipment, and he did fine. In later years, I found he moved down to Channel 4, and he was doing very well there, and somebody across the pasture offered him a job, and they gave him a big raise. And the story I heard, at least, was that he told them, "Oh, thank you very much. I love it here. I'm going to stay here forever." And he left for lunch and did the 6 o'clock news at 6 o'clock weather at Channel 9. And at that point in time, they started changing the names of the air people on the premise that if they had a stage name, they couldn't take the stage name with them. I don't think it really made any difference because people remembered the face, not the name anyway. But Wally Canaan came in at that time, big rotund Wally Canaan, who was a meteorologist. And Channel 4 was the first station, to my knowledge, that ever hired a meteorologist. Before that, they had weather people. They had announcers. They had cute girls. They had somebody who would read the weather. But here came Wally Canaan, who had spent some time at Tinker as a meteorologist, and they hired him as a full-time meteorologist. And after that, they had Bob Thomas, whose real name was Freeman, because they were using those stage names, and he was a meteorologist. And they had a whole series of meteorologists, including Jim Williams, who's still around. Jim Williams is also a meteorologist. Jim told me a funny story, by the way, which I think some people will appreciate. He had Bob Thomas had been promoted, gotten another job and gone to Chicago, and they made Jim Williams the chief meteorologist. And he was looking around for an assistant, and he knew about a guy in Dallas who was a really good meteorologist and good weatherman, and he called him to inquire if he'd be interested in coming up here and going to work for Channel 4. Of course, Channel 4 had a great reputation as a professional place for news and weather both. And he said, "By the way, what kind of money are you paying?" And the guy told him that he was making $25,000 a year where he was. And Jim Williams says, "I ain't making that kind of money." So he didn't hire the guy. I remember Danny Williams well. During the time I was at Channel 4, he and I lived a couple of blocks from each other. And Danny would do anything. He always wanted to try to do something a little different to make a little more impression. And the summer of 1950, we were doing, all the commercials were live in those days, and he was doing a commercial about a refrigerator. And he wanted to do something to be a little dramatic. So we took all of the racks out of the refrigerator, and I got in the refrigerator. And the deal was supposed to be that he was supposed to talk for 15 seconds and then open the refrigerator door, and I was going to step out and say, "You know, the light does go off when you close the door." And we did that, but it took him longer than 15 seconds. And by the time I got out, I was out of breath, and I said, "You know, the light does go off when you close the door." And he thought that was hilarious. He thought it was absolutely hilarious. Danny was a very smart guy. When the publishing company moved an old early computer that used those discs that you stuck in, cards that you stuck in the computer, moved it up to WKY radio to handle and program spots, because in radio you got lots and lots and lots of spots. Danny stood around and watched the guy who was installing it and asked him some questions and found out there was a manual about that computer, and he acquired that manual and read it from cover to cover. And they never, ever had to ask a technician to come fix that computer again because he knew how to fix it. He was a bright guy. We used to have lots of social get-togethers with KY staff, and he had a propensity to want to start a debate or an argument with somebody, and he'd take one side and have them take the other, and he'd just beat them up something terrible. And after about 30 minutes, he'd say, okay, well, that's enough. Now I'll take your side and you take mine. He'd beat you up again. Bright guy. One time I was out cruising, and in the old days, you took the WKY car, and if there was nothing going on, why, you just cruised around town with your police radio on, the two radio with the station, hoping something would break and you could go run cover it. And a guy pulls up next to me on about 3rd and Broadway and races his engine and says, I'm not going to tell you exactly what he said, but he said, that dirty Danny Williams, he said this yesterday, and he said that the day before, and he said something else last week, and I hate that guy. And I just smiled because Danny didn't care what you were saying about him as long as you were talking. Here was this guy who was just railing about Danny, and he never missed his program. And that was what Danny wanted, for people to never miss his program. He did things to have people talking, and talk they did. I remember that first summer at the little theater, before they even eliminated the seats in the little theater, and we had to run the whole studio on what was the stage, and it wasn't really that big. And everything was live. There was kinescope, but there wasn't any tape. And when they did the time on the half hour, they used a great big clock sitting on a chair. And they had all these lights going on, and I looked over and saw that the cap was off of the camera, and it was pointed at that, and those Oricon tubes would burn in, and if they burned in, they might ruin them, and they were really expensive. And I ran over and I jammed my hand in front of that lens, only to see the red light go on. And I thought, oh, I've done it now. But they didn't get upset about that. I worked with Jack Ogle for many years, and Jack Ogle was a really great guy, and he was good, and he had this great voice, and he did a super job. And there was another fellow there named Tuck Stadler, and Tuck was kind of like a college professor, only he was a hyper college professor. And I remember one Sunday we were working, and some local had called in and said, I've got a century plant that's blooming, and since it's a century plant, it only blooms once 100 years, and you ought to come do a story on it. And Stadler thought that was great. His air film was short for a weekend, and he sent me off to do a film story on this, quote, century plant. And I got there only to find out the century plant doesn't bloom every century. It's just what they call it. And I shot a little bit of film, and I took the guy's name, and I got back, and I said, Tuck, that isn't a century. That doesn't do anything every 100 years. It blooms every year. And he just went crazy. He accused me of trying to sabotage the station and trying to make him look bad. And I finally said, I'll process the film, and I'll give you the guy's name, and if you want to write a story, you can do so, but I'm not going to touch it. And he did write the story, and he did put it on the air, and I hate to say it, but I think he may have been the laughing stock of anybody who knew about plants. But that was a great contrast between his hypersensitivity about what was going on in the air and Jack Ogle's laid-back approach. I didn't really know Bob Berry really very well, but I was around him some, and the story I got was that he really wanted to see some OU football games. and he arranged to get a job as a spotter, to spot the players for the guy who was doing the announcement. And he worked that into what was obviously a phenomenal career. You know, he was a phenomenal sportscaster and did great work and had a long, successful career. And it all started because he wanted to see a football game and figured out a way to be a spotter to get to do it. When I first went to work for Channel 4, Ernie Schultz came very shortly after that out of the station in Enid and did the noon newscast, and ended up, after Bob Gamble and and the rest of those guys, became the news director. And he's a brilliant guy, did a great job. As a lot of people know, ended up being national president of Radio and Television News Directors Association. But he had a temper. And one time he got frustrated because somebody didn't do something right, and he kicked a hole in the wall of his office. And everybody thought that was awfully funny, that he would lose his temper and kick a hole in the wall in the office. I started out doing character parts on Little Kitty's radio program, and then worked part-time on the stage crew, and then worked full-time in the news department. Started out as a motion picture photographer because I'd been an Army motion picture photographer, which was my hopeful entrance into Army television, which I didn't get. But I evolved at a point in time. In the early days in Channel 4, you had to do everything. I was a photographer, I was also a reporter, I was an editor, I was a scripter. The first script I ever wrote took me an hour and a half to write, for a 60-second script. But you learn how to do those things. And I ended up being the assignment editor for a couple years and did a 5-minute newscast at the end of match game at 3:25 in the afternoon. And it was really a great career. Lots of people came through and came out and came and went. And I loved doing the job, but it was a great life, and I had lots of fun.